All right, welcome back to the MUST 341 synth tutorials. We're back to working on FM synthesis, but this time, instead of using an LFO as our modulator, we're using a second VCO. I do have an LFO here, and that is hooked up as before to the wave folder, and it's also hooked up to the wave shaper. I'm using that this time instead of a random source, although the random source is going to the wave folder as well. Other than that, it is functionally identical. It's the same patch. So here is what it sounds like right now with absolutely no modulation turned on. As you can see, my 8-vert attenuverters are both at the 0 position. This is what it sounds like. So we've got some cool wave shaping and wave folding, but that's about it. A little bit of spring reverb, nothing too special. Now here is where things get cool. At the attenuverter, I've created a feedback network so that one VCO can be sent to modulate the frequency of another, and I've got a second copy of the sine wave from the first VCO, the one that's controlled by the volts per octave signal from my keyboard, so that that can be sent to modulate the modulator VCO. So my carrier is up here, my modulator is down here, and I can adjust the relative amount of modulation for each of those. So let me start by increasing the amount of modulation going to the carrier, and then I will adjust the knob for the modulation of the carrier going to the modulator to create that feedback network. Okay, so we're still pretty normal. What if we start playing around with our wave folding values? And then using some more extreme values, we can get some really interesting sounds. Now, the other thing I can do is I can turn these into FM modes for linear as opposed to exponential. So here is a reset. And now I'm going to use linear frequency modulation. And as I change these, note that I've also got the second VCO at its pretty much max value. So I take that down all the way as far as it'll go back to about 11 Hertz. We can really dial in the modulation and get some cool sounds. And then if I take off the linear mode, as we start getting into exponential frequency territory, I start to really get a little bit more noisy and harsh. Keep in mind that you don't necessarily want to leave the original carrier frequency knob at middle C, at the default voltage. You might want to change that as well. And of course, you can experiment using linear FM on one of the two oscillators or both and see what you can get. So it's really cool, and if I turn on the spectrum, you'll see we have a huge amount of harmonics that are coming through here in really interesting bursts. Let me just play a couple of notes. So that's a really interesting thing to do with two oscillators. Again, they're both functioning at audio rate, and there's so many different ways that you can shape the sound using frequency modulation and having the frequency output of one affect the frequency of another, whether that's using linear or exponential modulation. Be careful when you do have them in a feedback network with this. Very small values are all you need to get very dramatic changes to the sound. But that's just a quick look at using a VCO for frequency modulation. The patch itself is already up on the learning management system, so download that and experiment with it. And then we're going to take a final look at FM in the classic sense using a complex oscillator in the next video.